So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first of two sessions where we want to introduce you to the MA in Islamic Studies or Contemporary Islamic Studies. My name is Dr. Gavin Picken. I'm Professor of Islamic Studies at the College of Islamic Studies, but I'm also the Program Coordinator for the Islamic Studies programs in general, and specifically for the MA, which is related to this event, which is the MA in Contemporary Islamic Studies. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this first session, which is really a test event about the types of courses that we run in the MA. In other words, we'll have short tester lectures from the faculty members of the program, and they will be talking on the specialist subjects that they teach in the program. To begin with, however, what I would like to do is just ask a basic question, is why would you want to study the MA in Contemporary Islamic Studies? The first reason that we might come up with is that we are situated in the Middle East and the heart of the Muslim world. In other words, many studies in Islamic studies are situated outside of the Muslim world in Europe or America, whereas in actual fact, what we have is a program which is situated inside of the Muslim world at the heart of the Muslim community. In addition to that, we have an iconic building which we can see there. Unfortunately, we can't meet with you in that iconic building because of COVID, but you can see that really we stand out even within the education city environment because of this extraordinary facility that we have with an exceptional infrastructure. But that's only part of the story, of course. One of the main reasons is that we have extraordinary faculty in the program, which we can see here, and you'll be meeting some of them later, so I'll save the introductions for later in the session. What we try to do in the College of Islamic Studies is that we try to create unique and innovative interdisciplinary programs which provide the opportunity to study traditional Islamic knowledge and place such knowledge in the context of the challenges faced by modern society. In other words, we are not just looking at the classical Islamic tradition. We're not a Kulliyat al-Sharia or the Sharia college as is traditionally understood, but we want to take that traditional understanding and place it in its contemporary context to face the challenges that we all face as people in modernity. In addition to that, one of the things that has struck me as one of the faculty members in the college is the diverse range of student profiles and nationalities that we have. In other words, we have Qatari students, we have students from the international context. I've taught students from Russia and the Ukraine and India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and even North America. So in other words, it is a diverse student mix and an opportunity to engage with Muslim students, usually from all over the world. The other advantage that we have is that we are a graduate institution, meaning that we only teach master's and PhD courses. At present, we only have master's courses, but nevertheless, what that means is that we normally teach in very small groups. So it's an opportunity to engage with your professors in a more intimate intellectual environment. In addition to that, we have several research centers where students can engage with the activity. So it isn't just the classroom environment that you're able to engage with, but there are research centers with several seminars and events of their own where students can engage with those as well. And in our case, one of the most pertinent things to mention is that we have several memorandums of understanding with international institutions, one of which is Oxford University. And our students, COVID permitting, of course, often travel to Oxford for a 1-month research visit in the last semester of their courses when they're doing their research theses. That's enough about the background, a little bit about the structure. Our program is unique within the college because it has two parts. One part is in English, which we call Contemporary Islamic Thought, which you can see on the left-hand part of the screen, and one which is called Islamic Law and Society, which is taught exclusively in Arabic, or Al-Fiqh wal-Mujtama. All students, however, whether they study in English or in Arabic, take a program foundation of 3 courses. And those 3 courses are the Foundations of Islamic Thought, Contemporary Quran and Hadith Studies, and Applied Research Methods in Islamic Studies. In other words, these are the essential courses that all students will need to continue with their study plan. After that, you will take required courses in each specialization. If you're studying contemporary Islamic thought, for example, the required courses are Islam and Modernity, Islamic Law and Society, Islamic Thought, and Post-Colonial Studies. And if you are studying Islamic Law and Society, you will study non-textual legal sources, politics in the state, fatwa, family and society, and fiqh. After that, you will take 3 specialization electives. And in the case of the contemporary Islamic thought taught in English, there's the opportunity to explore such subjects as the media and Muslim society, Islam and politics in the Muslim world, Muslim encounters with other societies, Muslim societies in diaspora, scientific thought in Muslim societies, and modern history of the Muslim world. Whereas on the Arabic side of things, if you're studying Islamic Law and Society, you can study 3 of the following, which are the higher objectives of Sharia and public interest, Nawazil and novel legal issues, text and context, comparative textual readings, social justice, community welfare and sustainable development, personal earnings and economics, Muslim social and political systems and institutions. After that, in your final semester, you will take a 9-credit thesis in which you will explore a research topic which is of interest to you. In other words, it won't be something that will be assigned to you by a supervisor, but on the contrary, something that interests you, something that sparks your imagination, so to speak, and something which you'll get a chance to explore in a research context. So what I'd like to do next, we might take questions about the college and the program later, but what I'd like to do now is just run through the schedule with you. I've done my introduction. We'll have a series of lectures which are representative of the courses that I've just mentioned, taught by our faculty. The first will be Dr. Yusuf Miri, who will be talking about Muslim encounters with other societies, one of the courses which is an elective in our program. Dr. Alex Cairo, who will be speaking about law and society in the Gulf Sheikdoms, which is part of his Islamic Law and Society course. Dr. Frank Peter, who will be speaking about nationalism in modern Islamic thought, because he deals with the course on Islam and modernity. And Dr. Joseph Lombard, who will speak about Quranic exegesis, because he deals with that within the context of contemporary Quran and Hadith studies. After that, we'll take questions and answers at the end. So as Izzadeen said, please be kind enough to type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll field the questions to the panelists at the end of the session. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'll introduce my first colleague. Of course, one of the major features of our program is the uniqueness of our faculty, who are renowned in their fields of specialism, and it's my pleasure to introduce them to you this evening. The first is Dr. Yusuf Miri, who is a historian in interfaith relations in the Middle East and is a specialist in Islamic history and civilization and the history of religions with a focus on the Abrahamic faiths. Currently, he is an associate of Georgetown University's Prince Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, where he focuses his research on tolerance and coexistence. And he'll speak to us on the topic of Muslim encounters with other societies. Dr. Yusuf, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Gavin, for your thorough introduction, which is much appreciated, and a warm welcome to our attendees. I'm going to now try to share with you the screen, hoping that inshallah this will work. This is one of the wonders of Cisco WebEx. So I have, I believe, successfully shared with you the screen. Let me just double check that. Yes. Okay. All right. Second here, just to make sure that everything is visible to the speakers. Salam and good evening. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good evening again. And thank you again, Dr. Gavin. One of the things that I want to discuss with you tonight, the major theme is pluralism, Islam, and modern challenges. This is one of the themes that I explore in my seminar on Muslim encounters with other societies, which also looks at various contexts and texts which relate to the encounters of Muslims in other societies, indeed in Western European and North American contexts, as well as in Islamic historical contexts as well. So what I will do first is explore with you the meaning of religious pluralism and discuss with you its expositors and its critics. We'll conclude with a very brief discussion of some of the modern challenges associated with pluralism. So let's start with the fundamental distinction. So what is the difference between pluralism and plurality? When we talk about plurality, plurality refers to the diversity of religions, cultures, languages, and views, whereas pluralism is a response to diversity that consists in learning about meaningful differences between different cultures and identities, engaging with different cultures and identities in sites where open dialogue is possible, preserving distinct religious commitments. This is from the Harvard Pluralism Project, and I will come to the Harvard Pluralism Project in a moment. This is only one definition of pluralism. This needs to be emphasized. And it should be emphasized that pluralism is not the only way to understand diversity. So there are different types of pluralism. And here are the 6 major categories. The first is religious pluralism. The second is ethnic and linguistic pluralism, often grouped together. Moral and ethical, including philosophical, political, cultural, and indeed legal. So in the Western tradition, the roots of religious pluralism go back to the late 18th and the early 19th centuries with the German intellectuals and the philosopher Georg Hegel, who died in 1831, and the philosopher and theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, who died in 1834. Now, pluralism as a concept is often employed in the context of interreligious dialogue. These terms were first introduced by the British theologian Alan Race in 1983. The first category is inclusivism. And where does pluralism fit? Inclusivism is one's own religion. It recognizes that one's own religion is the true religion, while other religions contain elements of truth and are therefore imperfect. The second category is exclusivism. So one set of religious beliefs is ultimately true and correct. And finally is pluralism, that all faiths are true and show different paths to the same truth. So inclusivism, just very briefly, is a way of approaching and thinking about the salvation of others in a Christian theological context. So these terms arise in this particular context of Christian engagement with other religions. Now, one of the first academic expositors in the modern age of this concept of religious pluralism was the Canadian historian of religion and Christian-Muslim relations, the late Wilfred Cantwell Smith. He argued for a more inclusivist stance toward other religions. Basically, the revelation of all world religions comes from the same divine source. If God is the kind of God revealed in Jesus Christ, then people of other faiths are saved. And finally, religious history is about human activity. This is an important point that I'm going to come back to in the course of our discussion today. So Smith argued for a more inclusivist stance toward other religions. For Smith, salvation was no longer exclusively for Christians, but for non-Christians who did not need to embrace the divinity of Jesus Christ. In a similar fashion, we have John Hick, the late British philosopher who was a major advocate for pluralism. He mentions that the objective in pluralism is to move from the human existence from transform human existence from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. That is, moving from one's own, in this case, Christian-centric view of the relationship between the individual and God to one that acknowledges the universality of the paths or approaches to God, to reality centeredness. So we're moving away from Christian-centric to a more inclusivist approach to one's relationship with God. Now, he interestingly gave a lecture in 2005 in Iran, in which he acknowledges that there is in Islam a form of inclusivism. He doesn't use in this lecture the word pluralism, interestingly. He does not engage with the word pluralism in this particular lecture, but he is referring to the use of the term or the designation Ahl al-Kitab, the people of the book, which he regards as limited inclusivism. I'm not going to read to you this entire passage, but what I am going to point out is that Hick was exploring the relationship of Christianity, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with the Eastern religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Taoism. So, does this notion suggest an Islamic form of inclusivism, as Hick maintains? Why? As a historical and scriptural concept, this offers one way of looking at inclusivism, but also one has to consider the very complex historical processes and the societal realities that exist or have traditionally existed within Islamic societies. So just to focus on Hick's emphasis on religious pluralism, in other words, he argues that no one religion in the highlighted areas has a monopoly of the truth or of the life that leads to salvation. And here he invokes Jalaluddin Rumi, the saying that's attributed to a Rumi, speaking of the religions of the world: the lamps are different, but the light is the same. It comes from beyond. So, and finally, at the end of this passage, he is advocating for a pluralist theology of religions to make sense, as he puts it, of the situation. We next move to Diana Eck. In the context of the United States in the 20th and 21st centuries, we discuss dialogue and constructive dialogue in the United States and the United Kingdom in this seminar. Here I just like to highlight Diana Eck's definition of pluralism. And she focuses not just on the philosophical or the theoretical aspects of pluralism, but also on the social dimensions, which is quite important to understanding pluralism. As she says, pluralism is not diversity alone, but the energetic engagement with diversity. Pluralism is not just about tolerance, but the active seeking of understanding across lines of difference. Pluralism is not relativism, but the encounter of commitments. Pluralism is based on dialogue. So Eck is, in fact, a professor of Indology at Harvard, and her contribution to this debate is not just simply as a scholar who has decided as a committed Christian to comment on pluralism. She is, in fact, one of the leading expositors of pluralism in the world. She, in fact, created the project back in '91, and she's created the case study model, which we explore in our seminar, we ask students to engage in creating case studies following the Harvard model. So we teach you these useful skills in the seminar. So what is Islamic pluralism? Is it the same as Quranic pluralism? We ask this question. We're not going to be able to satisfactorily reply to these questions in the time remaining, but is there a distinction or a distinct notion of Islamic pluralism? In a Christian theological context, as we've seen, religious pluralism is connected with the issue of Christian salvation. Is it connected to the salvation of others necessarily? Not necessarily in the case of, as you've seen from Diana X's comments, we are now also focusing on the social dimensions of pluralism. Is it even appropriate to employ the term Islamic pluralism? After all, this is an anachronistic term for which no lexical precedence exists in the Islamic canon. If we turn to the Quran, Surah 13, verse 49, which is often cited in studies of pluralism by Islamic proponents of pluralism, and we'll come to one of those as well as a critic at the same time. O mankind, behold, we have created you into nations and tribes so that you might come to know one another. Verily, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the one who is the most deeply conscious of God. So does this Quranic verse reference pluralism? It certainly references the plurality of nations and tribes, but not to pluralism as an interpretation or as a means or mode of interpreting plurality. One must consider the context. This cannot be emphasized enough. Similarly, in the context of Islamic history, one may consider such important sources as the Pact of Medina, which we also discuss in seminar, which was a mutual defense pact to defend the rights of Muslims and the Jewish tribal allies at the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Before we come to an advocate of pluralism, a Muslim advocate of pluralism, we turn to Muhammad Gary Lagenhausen, the Muslim American scholar who rejects religious pluralism on a number of grounds. I'm not going to read to you his entire slide, but what I'd like to point out is that his critique is largely one of the liberal Protestant enterprise, that in fact, historically, it was liberal Protestants, we're talking about in the late 18th century, early 19th century, as we mentioned, that undertook this, the development of ideas pertaining to religious pluralism. So the seeds were planted in this period and indeed in the context of Western Europe. Just to briefly look at the last point here, he emphasizes the elements common to personal religious faith, particularly, as he says in his critique, the inward turning toward the ultimate, while the outward expressions of faith and religious law, ritual and theological doctrine are considered to be of secondary importance. This is his one of the main points in his critique. So these are sample questions that we, for instance, from what perspective is he approaching pluralism? And this is a sample question that we approach in the seminar itself. And we contrast his view with the views of other Muslim critics as well. And we also look, in this case, at this whole notion of toleration. And I just want to look at the first point out of these 4 points. This is like, as he says, of religious pluralism, that toleration of different faith traditions is what it purports to foster, but in fact, it prescribes the mutilation of these traditions in order to eliminate the ultimate differences among them. So this is like the very notion of syncretism, the very idea of syncretism, which we discussed, that is creating a new super religion or a space in which one relinquishes aspects of one's own religion and embraces new religious ideas in their place. again, the first point of Lagenhausen, this particular slide, which is the fifth of his points, the very concept of religious experience is the invention of liberal Protestantism and is foreign to traditions such as Islam, he argues. Yet for many Muslims today, the challenge is how to interpret pluralism. One of the issues I have been exploring with my students this term is the notion of religious experience. He, of course, rejects personal religious experience and Islamic mysticism as a basis for personal religious experience. He rejects tasawwuf or Sufism. And we, of course, take up this very interesting discussion as well. Now I'd like to briefly turn, before concluding and looking at modern challenges, I'd like to look at the views of Muhammad Hashim Kamali, an Afghani scholar based in Malaysia. He is a legal scholar who looks at the concept of deep pluralism and the notion of active pluralism, a useful distinction. The first, deep pluralism recognizes the differences that exist between religions and then engages in them in order to gain a sound understanding of the values and commitments of the different other. It seeks an active understanding of the other as well. This is a concept that he borrows from the modern day British philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, who died in 1947. However, Whitehead was not referring to religious pluralism and its relationship to values and commitments, but rather to religious experience. So deep pluralism refers to pluralism rather, as he uses the word kamali, ta'addudiyya samha, which is a tolerant form of pluralism. So he uses this in the generic, which implies recognition and engagement, inclined towards facilitation and ease. And here he uses the Arabic ta'addudiyya diniyya as religious pluralism, a direct translation of the term itself. So active pluralism, as we said, means acknowledging and engaging differences, but without any attempt to impose hegemony. This is his formulation, that is Kamali's formulation of religious pluralism as active pluralism. And finally, we come to a number of modern challenges. That is, what challenges do minority religious communities, particularly in the West, experience? This includes Muslims living in Europe and North America and elsewhere. Some of the challenges include how to translate pluralist thought into action, to go back to the ideas that we've been discussing. So how do we do this? Adapting and transforming religious identities. This is more of a process through actively participating and contributing to inclusive citizenship, particularly relevant in the United States and Europe. Promoting awareness of intra-Muslim diversity, and finally engaging in dialogue with non-Muslims, for example, Christians, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists. But for many Muslims, the challenge today, the challenge is not merely to reflect on pluralism from the perspective of Islamic thought, but to translate thought into action and create more inclusive social, cultural, and political frameworks. So students, academics, activists, and theologians are very much involved in this undertaking. Certainly, this is one of the greatest challenges that Muslims living in the West experience. How might we translate pluralist thought into action? We further explore these themes in the seminar by, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned the case study model and actually producing case studies. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you will apply to the MA program. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
And many thanks to Dr. Yusuf for completing his talk almost perfectly on time, and for enlightening us regarding the issue of pluralism and how it might relate to Muslim encounters with other societies. Our second speaker is Dr. Alexander Cairo. He's an associate professor of Islamic Studies at CIS. He was trained in sociology and Islamic studies in France, in the Netherlands, and Egypt. His research deals broadly with the transformations of Islamic law in modern contexts. He's currently working on the legal history of the Gulf Sheikdoms, focusing on the interaction between emirs, Sharia judges, merchants, and British agents in the context of the development of an oil economy and the modern state institution. I'm sure he might examine some of those topics, if not briefly, in detail in his talk, which is about law and society in the Gulf Chieftains. Dr. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gavin. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for the organizers for this opportunity. Today, I want to speak to you briefly about my course, Islamic Law and Society. As you might have seen, it's one of the courses that students typically take in their first year of the two-year MA program in Contemporary Islamic Studies. It's a fun course to teach, and it's a course that seeks to achieve a number of objectives, including the identification of the main figures and institutions of legal authority in the Muslim world. Students become able to describe the legalism that characterizes Islamic civilization and also provide an account of how law was used, debated, and contested. They highlight the forms of legal pluralism that have characterized Muslim societies. They examine the changing role of pre-modern and modern state and state institutions in law and society. They become able to differentiate between various theoretical approaches to the study of law and society. So the course is very interdisciplinary, and I think part of what makes it interesting is the fact that we read a wide range of texts, including scriptural texts, Quran and Hadith, fiqh texts, history, philosophy, and also sometimes travel accounts and literature. And the course is structured, as you see here, in 4 parts. In the first part, a more introductory part that lasts 2 sessions. We discuss literary and historical approaches to law and society. So here we read people like Ibn Battuta and his troubles working as a Qadi in India and in the Maldives. We read Hariri when Abu Zaid goes into the courtroom of a local Qadi and tries to use or sometimes subvert the law for his own purposes. And we read sometimes mystical and philosophical texts that allow us to shed some light on questions of law and society as a way of introduction. We then turn to the second module, Figures and Institutions of Legal Authority, and here we look at qadis, muftis, and state actors, and the ways in which they have crafted and worked in legal settings. So again, we always draw on a combination of primary and secondary source material. So we look at figures like Mawardi or Qarafi or Nizam al-Mulk to think about some of these legal actors. But then we also draw on works from within anthropology, Islamic studies, intellectual history, to think about what kinds of questions one might ask about these figures and institutions of legal authority and how those change. In the third part, we take a number of topics in law and society, and these topics might change from one year to the other, but usually it covers questions of marriage and divorce, which is, of course, a very central feature of legal discussions, including in modern contexts. And we read some of the pre-modern literature that often confounds modern expectations regarding family structures in Islamic civilization. And then we confront those with more modern accounts of family life in Egypt and elsewhere. We also deal with Islamic criminal law, crime and punishment, what kinds of mechanisms existed within the Sharia for the application of criminal law, what kinds of debates took place, and how were these reformed in the Ottoman Empire, in Egypt, in South Asia, and so on. And today, really, I want to focus on the final module, a module on law and society in the Gulf, which is one that is quite closely related to my own research interests at the moment. And like all the other modules, it is very interdisciplinary in its approach. It deals with a wide range of texts. But I think what is specific about Law and Society in module is that it helps students acquaint themselves with primary source material directly, right? So historical documents that complement the secondary scholarship that is available to us. Now, Law and Society in the Gulf for a long time was a kind of poor parent of Law and Society studies because the Gulf supposedly had left very little records or archives for scholars to draw upon. This is somewhat true because we don't have the kind of publicly accessible materials that exist for other places, including the Ottoman Empire, Egypt, and so on, South Asia. However, it is not true that one cannot do important new research in the field of law and society. And I try to demonstrate in this course, in this final module, is the kind of materials that are available for us, for our students, our graduate students, and other scholars who want to take up this question. And I illustrate questions of theory and method through a close engagement with some of these primary source materials. So I want to speak to you a little bit about this module here. It consists of 4 weeks, and we start with an introduction that tries to think about what was the legal landscape of the Gulf Sheikhdoms before oil. So roughly until the mid-20th century for a place like Qatar. What kinds of sources we have available to us, and what might be the scope, but also the limits of these sources. In the following week, we look at the pearl trade. As is well known in the Gulf, the pearl trade was the single most important economic activity in the Gulf Sheikhdoms before the discovery and exploitation of oil. And in a place like Qatar, it is estimated that roughly 90% of the male population worked in pearling before the 1940s. And so it was a very important activity. And as we find out in the course of this week, it was one that is also regulated in a specific manner through specific legal forums and legal actors known as Salifa judges and Salifa courts. So thinking about the legal regulation of such a critical economic activity actually allows us to understand in a clear manner the legal landscape and the contours of legal authority in a particular historical moment. In the third week of this module, we deal with Islamic law more directly, and we think about Islamic law in the 20th century, before and after oil wealth and modern state institutions, right? And so we approach this with an open-ended manner, and we basically want to know what do the sources tell us about the jurisdictional authority of Islamic law in the Gulf in the 20th century. And then we end up the module with what is one of the most vibrant, lively, controversial subjects in the public spheres in Qatar and in Gulf societies, the question of family life and the transformation of family structures, and what is often described as the crisis of the family in the Gulf. So this is roughly the structure of the module. Now, for each week, we have a series of texts that allow us or allow our students to have some contextual background regarding the questions that we address. And so for the first week, we look at a kind of historical anthropological study of what authority looked like in the pre-oil Gulf. And this text allows our students to identify in the figure of the ruler or the sheikh, not only a political figure, but also a main legal actor, right? Someone whose prerogatives include the settlement of disputes and the implementation of penalties, even though this is always to some extent negotiated. In addition to this reading from history and anthropology, we have a piece that looks more critically at one of the most important sources of documentation for the history of the modern Gulf, which is Loraymer's Gazetteer of the Persian Gulf, Oman, and Central Arabia. Right? This is not only in English language scholarship, but also in Arabic language scholarship, one of the major references for the history of the Gulf. It was originally a confidential document that circulated within the British agencies in the Gulf Sheikdoms, but also in India and in the UK. And it provides incredibly detailed information about political and economic history, primarily, but also in geographic history or knowledge. And here, our students become able to identify some of the purposes of this knowledge production, colonial knowledge production, which will be helpful for them to navigate the primary source materials that they will have to explore. So this week, in order for our students to get a sense of what the legal landscape was like before oil, we draw on the Persian Gulf Residency monthly news summaries or reports. These are reports produced by officials working within the British agencies, many of whom were so-called native informants. And they are reporting on a wide range of information, including, crucially, a number of issues that are of critical interest for a study of law and society. Now, these materials are very long and require a lot of patience. Each of these files can run up to 1,000 pages each and will include a range of material that is not strictly speaking necessary. So what I do is I make a selection of these texts and I give it to the students for them to start thinking about a number of questions. One is, how were legal disputes settled? What kind of legal actors were involved in the arbitration and settlement of conflicts? And also, connected to that, what do these British archives actually contain? What might be their biases, but also the usefulness for a study of law and society? And so the potential of these materials for a study of law has long been recognized, but it's still very much a desideratum within the field of Gulf studies. And so what students have to do is to pick on some of these notices produced by the British officials and think about the legal problems that they articulate, right? And students need to identify the identity of the legal actors, the legal strategies, and the normative frameworks that they invoke. And so these notices are often very brief, but they nevertheless shed important light on these issues. And it is one way that of introducing questions of legal pluralism, questions of jurisdictional politics, and the exercise of legal agency by a variety of actors. And so I allow students to think about these questions in a very hands-on manner by drawing on this material. In week 12, we move on to the pearl trade. And once again, we have a range of contextual readings that allow students to understand the pearl trade in several of its manifestations. So the first piece focuses on British efforts to regulate the pearl trade and explains why the British identified the pearl trade as a strategic area that was central to their imperial project in the Gulf. The The second project, written by a Bahraini historian, allows us to understand how the pearl trade actually worked, and the ways in which different pearling actors experienced and benefited or were otherwise oppressed by the structures of the pearl trade as it existed before the discovery of oil, so until the 1930s, 1940s. So this is important background material for students then to plunge into another set of primary sources. Here we look at a number of important legal documents. So some of these are produced by British authorities. Others are produced for British authorities by local actors. And they include an 1879 agreement brokered by the British that criminalizes absconding sailors who move from one sheikhdom to the other in order to escape debt. The second document is the earliest codification of the laws in the pearl trade that we have, dating from 1912, which is the work of a number of British agents across the sheikdoms, and actually including on the Persian coast of the Persian Gulf, from 1912. And then we have a number of petitions from Sunni boat captains in Bahrain who protest some of the measures that the British took in the 1920s, some of the ways in which the British authorities sought to reform the trade. And so we have here, again, a set of colonial sources, but that shed important light not only on colonial perspectives or the perspectives of the British, but also include a number of petitions. And the petitions are interesting because they show how local actors in the Gulf could appropriate the languages of colonial legality for ways that could sometimes naturalize colonialism, but also subvert some of its logics. And so students, when they look at these sources, they have a number of tasks to complete. They have to understand on the basis of some of these documents how the British became central actors in the regulation of the pearling industry from the late 19th century onwards. But also, what role did Islamic law and Islamic legal actors play in the regulation of the pearl trade, as opposed to the role of Salafid judges and British officials. So the pearl trade was one where institutionally was quite distinct from Sharia law. It was governed in places called Salafid courts, as I mentioned before, by Salafid judges, working increasingly under the authority of British authorities in the Gulf and in India. Now, when they turn to the petitions, then students try to think about the ways in which the voices of these non-colonial actors and the ways in which non-colonial actors position themselves in relation to British attempts to reform the pearl trade, right? And so how a certain language of colonial legality also furnished or provided local actors with tools for the subversion of colonial projects. And British archives contain quite a few of these petitions. And so even though British archival material obeys or has a certain colonial logic that underlies it, it is possible to read it against the grain to find the voices of non-colonial subjects. And so part of the exercise here is for students to learn how to read the colonial archive along its grain, but also against its grain, to borrow on some of the historical formulation. Okay, then moving on to Sharia law, we have another sets of texts that provide some of the context here that is important for us to understand what role might Islamic law have played in the legal landscape of the Gulf in the 20th century. The first text draws primarily on British sources and focuses on British efforts to reform the legal system. The second text provides a bit of a counter perspective. It looks at Islamic institutions in Qatar and how they were established and developed in the course of the 20th century. And so the two texts work nicely to provide some of the context. But once again, what we want the students to do is to familiarize themselves with primary source material. And so some of this material comes from British archives and from reports written by sometimes Sudanese judges or British officials who visit the Gulf Sheikhdoms and write reports about the legal landscape. Other material that is available for us are laws that are passed from the 1960s onwards, before and after independence, that shed light on some of the struggles between different judiciary apparatus. So we have the Sharia judiciary, that was represented by the Presidency of Sharia Courts established in 1957, alongside with a new system of courts of justice in 71. So laws allow students to think about some of these battles over jurisdictional authority that were, as they unfolded in the second half of the 20th century. And we also have fatwa. We have fatwas from here, Qatar's most senior judge, who established, founded, and is widely credited in Qatar with the development of a Sharia judiciary, right? The first judge to actually codify and record decisions of Sharia courts in a systematic manner, and the first official also to officiate or adjudicate cases in a purpose-built court in Qatar. And so here, students explore these sources with a number of questions in mind, including strategies that the British deployed in order to reform the legal system. Also, the ways in which laws determined or perhaps underdetermined the kind of jurisdictional struggles that unfolded in Qatar, creating certain zones of jurisdiction, but also sometimes blurring the boundaries between these two courts. And then we have, for students who can read the Arabic texts, questions about the fatwa that were issued and the kinds of concepts that were mobilized by muftis and judges in order to guide the emerging state actors and institutions in the course of the 20th century. Including some of the ways in which these judges positioned themselves over the battles between civil courts and Sharia courts in the 20th century. Okay, then in my final week, what we focus on is debates about family law. And so I include here one of my own publications together with an important study by two scholars on debates about family law and family policy in Qatar in the late 20th century. And so here again, we have a number of sources that are available to us that students can use to think in a hands-on manner on about family issues, family problems, family struggles. These include the famous 2006 family law, but also a number of rulings by the Court of Cassation on so an appeal court in Qatar addressing questions of family, divorce, pension, and so on. We also have a number of fatwas from Islam Web, which is a ministry affiliated website that offers religious advice to Qatar's population, and some media articles. So here, students learn to read critically a legal text and to think about the legal indeterminacies that even a codified text can give rise to, so that we identify issues that are unaddressed or insufficiently addressed in the family law. and we think about some of the questions and or problems that might arise in the course of its application by judges. We also think about what are the issues, what are the judicial controversies that courts actually face by looking at the Court of Cassation decisions. And then we think about how religious authorities actually intervene in these debates about family law, right? So there are two questions that I ask students to consider. One is this mandatory premarital medical tests that are required by the state of Qatar and other states in the Gulf. And the other is the issue of consanguineous marriage, right? So this is an opportunity for them to think about how Islam Web, the website of the Ministry of Awqaf, relates to broader discourses, laws, and regulations in the Qatari state. Okay, so what are the objectives of this? By having students confront primary sources and historical documents directly, I want them to realize that law and society is a vibrant new field of scholarship for which a lot of new archives are emerging. How one might work with a range of primary source material, and how one might think about its scope and limits. How one can actually raise important questions of theory and method in a very concrete manner by looking at these sources, rather than thinking in an abstract manner about colonial archives or non-colonial sources. We learn to actually explore these in a detailed manner in the course of these studies. And by doing this, I think students who are interested in the Gulf become also able to conceptualize or start conceptualizing and visualizing what an MA thesis project in the field of law and society might look like. So thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I'll be around to answer. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alex, for a very detailed introduction to how the courses look at in the MA in Contemporary Islamic Studies. I'm sure that the students have a good idea of what they might be coming up against once they apply and get accepted, inshallah. We're starting to get a few questions in. They're mostly related to the technicalities of applying to the MA. Of course, we welcome those and we'll answer them in due course. Just to remind the participants, if there are any questions related to the content, that is equally welcome. So if you've heard anything in the short talks that you would like to ask a question about, you're most welcome. And you don't need to wait till the Q&A session to ask the question. You can ask this question now, and we can deal with it at the appropriate time. Our next speaker is Dr. Frank Peter. He's an assistant professor of Islamic Studies at the College of Islamic Studies, who has studied modern history, Islamic and Middle Eastern studies, and Arabic in Germany, France, and Syria. Before joining HBKU, he was an assistant professor of Islamic and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Bern. And his latest monograph, entitled Islam and the Governing of Muslims in France, Secularism Without Religion, was recently published, and I'm sure you might touch on a few of the topics therein in his talk entitled Nationalism in Modern Islamic Thought. The floor is yours, Dr. Frank.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this introduction. Welcome, everyone. I would like to briefly present the course Islam and Modernity and talk about the topic of nationalism in modern Islamic thought. So I'm going to start by outlining briefly the general approach of this course, and then I will give you an example of the kind of questions we raise and the kind of primary sources we are using in this course. So first of all, so what do we study in this course? Islam and modernity. We are dealing primarily with debates between scholars, intellectuals, and activists from, roughly speaking, the 18th century until today. And these debates are mainly about changes in social life. So topics include notably functioning of government, so what you could call like political modernity, including nationalist politics, or includes the relation between state and religion, so theories of secularism and how they were debated and impacted societies in the Islamic world, and the rise of market economies and the public spheres, and the new kind of debates about religious topics which took place in these mediated public spheres. So this is kind of like the topics we are covering in this course. And as I said, I want to start by outlining like two different approaches in a very schematic manner, how you can study these topics. So one approach, like hypothetically speaking, would consist in asking and examining like what is the Islamic ruling on a specific topic, like nationalism, democracy, or human rights, mechanisms of capitalist economies. So here the main focus is on like reconstructing how people have decided the lawfulness or not of certain social practices which became dominant or very important in the course of modernity, in the course of the last 2 centuries. And here the guiding assumption, broadly speaking, the guiding assumption is that these are new ideas and institutions like nationalism, democracy, and they originate in the West, and they have become disseminated in the course of Western expansion, colonialism, and imperialism. So this is, of course, like an important and it's an indispensable perspective to adopt if you want to study Islamic modernity. But there are also like certain limitations or problems with this approach, and I want to mention only one, which has to do with the simple fact that these terms, which I mentioned above, like human rights, democracy, or nationalism, are heavily contested. They are defined in different ways, and there's no consensus, far from it, on any of them. And like to a large degree, this disagreement on how to define, for example, nationalism reflects different understandings of how these ideas have been understood in history and in the present. Right. So this is like a limitation which leads me to like expand, like to propose a kind of different approach. But before I do this, I want to illustrate like what kind of definitional problems we grapple with when approaching a topic like nationalism. So I'm not saying it's impossible to come up with a working definition of nationalism, which is understood. That's quite possible. Here's like a basic standard definition of nationalism. Nationalism stipulates the principle of self-rule for each nation, and a nation is a group defined by various shared features such as language, history, specific relation to territory, and so forth. So this would be a definition which you are familiar with and which allows you to communicate efficiently. But if you take like a closer look in a historical and in a comparative perspective of how nationalism has been defined and practiced by nationalists, like multiple disagreements, differences become apparent. And these are not minor disagreements, right? And these are disagreements which are like the starting point of an important broad debate in scientific literature, in nationalism studies, and other fields. So one question would be here, how new or how modern nationalism actually is, right? And so this question, the background to this question is, of course, that nationalism or nationalists argue largely on historical grounds. They refer to groups which have a long history, and it is because of this history and the specific connection to a certain plot of land that the claim to construct a state to rule themselves is legitimated. So, and furthermore, groupness or the existence of groups on the basis of ancestry, language, or certain cultural practices, of course, not a new phenomenon. So that's like one question which leads to very different, can lead to very different answers or really different schools and definitional approaches. The second definitional problem would be what exactly does nationalism require from citizens in terms of attitudes and practices, right? So more concretely, so does the allegiance to the nation override necessarily all other commitments of the individual? For example, religious commitments or other philosophical commitments. What is the difference, to put the question differently, like what is the difference between patriotism, which you can define simply as the love of one's country or attachment to one's country, and nationalism? And patriotism would be like a phenomenon which you can certainly predate back much in a longer perspective. Finally, the third like definitional issue, nationalism aims to create a state in order to realize the interests of the nation, but how exactly is membership in the nation defined? Do you become a member of a nation only by descent, because your parents are? Are there ways of joining a nation? Is it because you're born in a specific piece of land, even if you're not, if your parents are not members of that nation, etc.? So there are multiple questions, and not only practical questions, but these questions have played a major part in debates by intellectuals all over the world who have defined specific theories of nationalism for nationalist movements. And connected to this question is then the question, what about minorities? What about individuals who do not belong to the nation as it is defined by its leaders, but live in the country which is ruled by this nation? Are these individuals simply second-class citizens? What kind of arrangements have been made with these non-nationals, with these minorities? Is it possible to share the nation with non-nationals? Is it possible to have like more liberal nationalism? So these are like, as I said, like these are not like minor disagreements. They are important on the conceptual level and also have important practical consequences. And the second approach takes these disagreements like seriously in a certain sense. Of course, this approach is also interested in normative claims. So it's interested in the question, what is the Islamic ruling on nationalism? What kind of arguments are made by scholars on this point? This is also like central to this second approach, but in the second approach, modernity is not considered as like a fully defined political and cultural program, which was developed in the West and which was exported from the West in the course of the 18th, 19th, 20th century. Rather, we define modernity here as a discursive context in which new questions emerge and become urgent. For example, questions about political order and the possibility and legitimacy of creating a nation states. So, as I said, like this approach takes the definitional problems seriously, but it does not expect to fully solve them, right? And that's not a minor point, because like the assumption here is that these definitional problems reflect incoherencies or complexities in Western modernity itself. So here the focus shifts to examining how these definitional problems, different definitions and perceptions of institutions such as democracy or nationalism, are part of the debate about modernity in Islamic contexts. So the question is like, how do these actors, these scholars or intellectuals, and under what constraints, in what kind of political context, how do they describe the changes around them in society, and how do they evaluate what should or can be done in light of the tradition? So I want to illustrate this briefly with an example of a quite famous debate about nationalism, which took place in the second half of the 1930s in British India. And this is a debate which took place in media, in print media, and which is like illustrates a bit what kind of questions and what kind of sources you will be working with in this course, both in the classroom and then when writing term papers, etc. So this debate, as I said, took place in the 1930s in British India, at a moment when the political future of India after independence was debated, when various groups debated how to structure the political order of an independent India and how to define relations between the Muslim minority and the Hindu majority, how to define the place of Muslims in the national movement against British occupation in India. So one scholar, Hussain Ahmed Madani, is the starting point, triggered this debate, and he's the author of a book titled Composite Nationalism, which was published in 1938 in Urdu. And this is like an example for how you can, with the kind of debate about nationalism which took place in various parts of the Islamic world in modernity. So I want to briefly describe like one part of the argument here and the response. So the author study, or actually quite a long part of this study, is an examination of how the word qawm is used in the Quran. And one of the questions, the most directly relevant question the author is examining is here, does qawm refer to mixed groups, to a group which includes believers, both believers and other individuals? And so he's examining, or he's listing all kind of evidence from the Quran in order to show that this can be found, such as in this verse. And remember when Moses said unto his people, O my people, why do you hurt me, though you know well that I am the messenger of God unto you? So he's examining this kind of these kind of verses and using dictionaries in order to identify the specific usages of qawm in the Quran. So why is this question so important from his perspective? Other people in the debate disagreed. So the argument basically here is that if qawm sometimes designates mixed groups, right, from religious perspectives, the Quran basically sanctions affiliation and cooperation with non-believers. Right? And this is like the message Madani attempted to convey to the broader public. So this is how he puts it in this in the book, which was published subsequently to this debate. From a Quranic point of view, the word qawm in its essential meaning is used for any group of people having the same kinship and lingual, territorial, professional ties. There can be cooperation in nationalism and in national affairs between a Muslim and a non-Muslim. So this is like how he develops from this very small question about the meaning of qawm, like a kind of a political theory about the positioning of Muslims in the British colonial context. I want to emphasize one argument, one element of this argument, and this is, of course, that nationalism, from his perspective, is in principle not new and is sanctioned by the Quran, right? So this is it's not a new phenomenon from his perspective. And of course, so the author is not naive, and he's fully aware that nationalism has produced distinctively different effects in recent history. He talks about the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire due to nationalist movements which wanted to secede, wanted to create independent nation states. So he's very much aware of this, and he's reflecting, spends a good time of reflecting on these events. But his central argument is that the Quranic qawm means nation. And in this perspective, nationalism is not a new phenomenon, and qawm should be distinguished very clearly, or is distinguished in the Quran from the term millah, which refers to religious community. Right? So the argument is Miller can precisely be differentiated into different counts. So it is permissible from this perspective and advisable to cooperate with Hindus against the British, who treat all Indians as slaves, right, and who, from his perspective, constitute them as one kaum, as one nation, which should fight for its independence. So this is like one argument, one reflection on how can Muslims position themselves in the 1930s on in regard to the British occupation, colonialism, and the fight for independence. Now, there's like an important, this kind of statement triggered an important debate, and one the prominent scholar, philosopher, thinker, poet, Muhammad Iqbal responded to it several times. I cannot, of course, reconstruct the debate here, but one central point of contention in this discussion is, and this is what I want to insist upon, that Iqbal argues basically that Madani misidentifies the object under examination. So a central argument which he makes is that it's erroneous to consider nations in the 20th century as simply another manifestation of the Quranic kaum. So he's saying that we need to temporalize, historicize these terms, and take into account that nation in the early 20th century is a political principle which necessarily implies marginalization of religion and rivalry between humans. So which has a destructive, inherently destructive impetus. So which leads him to develop then a counter proposal which focuses on the universal concept of Ummah, of course. So now I cannot reconstruct this debate, and I cannot also decide who makes the stronger argument, either Madani or Iqbal. What I hope this sketch has shown is that any analysis of this debate about nationalism goes far beyond scriptural interpretation, well defined. So this debate, as many others in this field of Islamic modernity, builds on and participates in a much broader global exchange conversation about political theory, about modern conceptual transformations and historical developments in the Islamic world and the West. So if you want to analyze such debates, this requires going an extra step, and it requires notably drawing more on social sciences, using the resources from fields such as political theory or nationalism studies. And this extra step is, I think, both necessary and rewarding. I think you've seen why it is necessary, and it is rewarding because you get, of course, a much better understanding of what these scholars actively and activists and intellectuals actually did. You get a better sense of their agency. And so this is what we will do in this course, basically. I better stop here. Thank you.
Many thanks also to Dr. Frank, who is almost perfectly on time also, for enlightening us regarding the various kind of contours of nationalism and how it was debated within the Muslim world. Final speaker, last but not least, is Dr. Joseph Lombard, who is an associate professor of Quranic Studies at the College of Islamic Studies. He's previously taught at the American University of Sharjah, Brandeis University, and the American University of Cairo. He received his PhD in Islamic Studies from Yale University and has studied with scholars in Morocco, Egypt, Yemen, Jordan, and Iran. His scholarship contributes to the fields of Islamic philosophical theology, Sufism, and primarily Quranic studies. He served as author, translator, and general editor for the Study Quran, and is the content creator for the popular Edu podcast, A Quran for All Seasons. We welcome Dr. Joseph to speak about the topic Quranic exegesis. Dr. Joseph, the floor is yours.
Mine, we should say. Assalamu alaikum. So I hope that everyone can hear me, inshallah. So I was going through this topic today, and as I was preparing for this lecture, I realized that in many ways, one of the issues that we have is that with tafsir in particular, which I'm going to talk about today, is that tafsir is a field where we have, sorry. All right. Tafsir is a field where there are constant developments. But the way that we look at tafsir in this program pertains to the entire structure of the program, where we try to include dimensions of post-colonial studies. Now, for post-colonial studies, our purposes in employing it are because it demonstrates the manner in which certain perspectives, Islamophobic perspectives and Orientalist perspectives, have curtailed and misrepresented dimensions of the classical Islamic tradition. And so we then try to look within the tradition to see the dimensions of the tradition that bring the principles that we can apply to contemporary exigencies, such as, for example, the environmental crisis or great wealth disparity across the world and issues of this nature. And this is interesting when you look at tafsir. If you study tafsir from within the Western academic tradition, usually the question is, what are the origins? How did it develop? What are these stages? Why did it develop at that stage? What are some of the outside influences? If, however, you're looking at tafsir from within the Islamic tradition, and depending on where you are, there will be certain tafsir that your teacher or your master, your sheikh, advises you to read. If you want a tabahur for the Quran, if you want to go deep into it, go wide and deep into understanding tafsir and Quran at the same time. Now, as you go through it, if you were to do that today, for example, somebody might advise you to read the tafsir of Al-Alusi or the tafsir of the Tunisian scholar Ibn Ashur, rahimahumullah. And both of these tafsir, the tafsir of Al-Alusi was written in the 19th century. The tafsir of Ibn Ashur was written in the 20th century. If, however, you start to go into the classical Western academic tradition, you start to see that these tafsir aren't treated very widely. So Muslims have traditionally written new tafsirs, and every major school of Islamic thought is writing a new tafsir, even as we speak. There are tafsir being written in the classical style so that they can apply the principles of tafsir and interpret the Quran in terms of contemporary needs. One could go back to what Dr. Frank Peter said and talk about how this relates to the new discursive contexts that Muslims are encountering. Now, to take this back to what I was saying about post-colonial theory, when we talk about the current context where we are trying to move beyond the effects of colonialism and colonialization, then we have to look at manners in which we can reclaim our exegetical tradition and our self-representation. So this is why I think that tafsir in particular is a very important genre to look at. And one could really say that when you get into tafsir, there are multiple different genres of tafsir, and sometimes, and in some ways, that idea of a new genre is something that changes due to the circumstances in which Muslims find themselves, both in terms of time and in terms of place. There are going to be different issues confronting an Indonesian community. Hence, you have the rise of Indonesian tafsir that are answering questions that are not necessarily answered within Arabic tafsir or Persian tafsir or tafsir that are written in Arabic within the Ottoman tradition. Now, what is tafsir? History and portrayal. when we get into tafsir, there are a lot of different questions that come into how we define it. And in many ways, one could say that there aren't satisfactory definitions. One would even say that that definitions that Muslims have given at different times, for example, if you look at the definition that Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi gives, it's really about the methodologies, the sciences that one must use within tafsir at the time. And many Sunni scholars will repeat the list of qualifications and methodologies that he advocates in his tafsir. Yet, his contemporary, who died in the very same year, Lagenhausen, whose tafsir was more widely distributed, at least in the manuscript tradition, and yet remains relatively unstudied today, had a different set of methodologies that he advocated one must know in order to comment effectively upon the Quran. Now, when you go into tafsir, there really is no comprehensive outline for the development of tafsir literature. Sometimes there's not even agreement upon what constitutes tafsir. Is it a genre? Is it more than a genre? The field is in many ways still in its infancy, and it really is one of the widest. I would say that one could really say that if you're going to classify it as a genre, it is probably the widest and most diverse genre of literature in the classical Islamic tradition. Now, in terms of the study of tafsir, what we would call tafsir studies, this is a field that is still very much in its infancy. And part of this is because of how vast the tradition is in the first place. And many of the tafsir remain in manuscripts. And even many of the printed tafsir that have come out in the past, really the past 10 years, there's been maybe 15 years, there's been somewhat of a revolution in printing many of the tafsir that people weren't reading regularly. And nonetheless, some of these printed editions have not been studied in depth. For example, one of the tafsirs that I really enjoy sometimes is Lubaba Ta'wil fi Ma'ani Tanzil of Ala-ad-Din Al-Baghdadi, who's really known by the name Al-Khazin. Some people will just call it Tafsir Al-Khazin. Now, like I mentioned him before, he died in the 14th century. His tafsir, there's not a single article written on his tafsir or on him in any Western language. But if you go back into the manuscript tradition, his tafsir was one of the 10 most widely read, or at least circulated, tafsir in the pre-modern tradition. This is the study that is actually, I need to credit Dr. Samuel Ross with this. This is actually a slide from one of his presentations where he talks about this issue. He's done a lot of this work, and so I'm playing off of his work here. But what we see here is that the total tafsir studies that have been published in the academic Western tradition is half of it comes in the last 15 years. Here, this is his line. He says that half of all tafsir studies were published after the year 2006. It shows how this is that is completely changing. And if anybody's out there who's looking for a PhD field, this is a field in which there are oceans and oceans and oceans of work for dissertations. Now, one of the things that one finds also when one studies, and again, this slide is from Dr. Samuel Ross. I was going to do this, and then I found that he did it so well, I just took this one from him. But that the existing literature that talks about Quranic tafsir often skips over the period in which we have the most tafsir that were studied within the Muslim world. So you see here, tafsir from the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th century. In the manuscript tradition, they are the most widely distributed. Yet, in terms of the tafsir that are studied within the Western academic tradition, they are the ones on which there is the least literature. And this has to do with some of the biases of the Orientalist tradition of always trying to go back and look for origins. How did things begin? There's almost kind of an obsession with origins rather than how did they unfold necessarily over time. Now, this is a fascinating study that is done by Dr. Samuel Ross. And I'm just using this to kind of set this overall stage to understand how important it is to look at tafsir from within the Islamic tradition rather than reading the studies of tafsir from without. Now you go here, and one of the things that Dr. Ross has studied is how these tafsir have been studied. And over here on this far column, you see the works that have been done that appear, that is the scholarship that appears regarding these particular tafsirs. Now look at this. For example, as I mentioned before Ali bin Muhammad al-Khazin, Lubab al-Ta'wir fi Ma'ani al-Tanzil. There are 326 manuscripts of this work there, and it was only edited and printed in the last 5 years, I believe, and there is not a single discussion of him anywhere. And it is the 8th most widely available tafsir in the classical tradition. This is even more amazing. You go up to a Sheikh Zadeh, who wrote a Hashia on the tafsir of Baydawi. 470 manuscripts. Not a single study has been done in the Western academic tradition. Now, what do we do with this? One of the things now I was going to go into, we could go into this and look through the whole of the tradition. This is what we go over. You can see some of this and how we go over and look at, I've come up with my own classification for how we talk about the history of the tradition, talk about the kind of inchoate, informal period, the compilation, the formal period, early classical, middle classical, late classical, and then the modern and contemporary period. The interesting thing that happens here is that when you're talking about what we call the modern period, there are still tafsir that are written in the style that was inaugurated in the early classical period. And this is where actually Norman Calder has a very good way to say what is tafsir. And because some people in the classical Islamic tradition, well, not in the classical, but some Muslims will say, well, the whole of the classical Islamic tradition is tafsir because the whole of the tradition is an unfolding of the Quran, and in that way, a commentary upon the Quran. That's a difficult thing to say, because from that perspective, we could say that that the Masnavi of Jalaluddin Rumi is commentary. We could say, yes, it has hermeneutical dimensions, but can we call it a tafsir? You could say that the Futuhat al-Makkiyah has hermeneutical dimensions, but you couldn't really call it a tafsir, properly speaking. And the Ihya Ulumuddin, again, has hermeneutical dimensions. Even one could say a hermeneutical theory to it. But again, it's not a tafsir, properly speaking. So this, I think Norman Calder's definition here is useful. He says the entire Quran, or at least a significant chunk of it, is interpreted in its canonical order, with segments of text being followed by commentary. The interpretations of a wide range of named authorities are cited, which results in a polyvalent reading of the text that acknowledges several possible meanings. The text of the Quran is measured against external structures, both instrumental and ideological. This last measurement, this last piece of the definition is actually very useful because it shows us the way in which we could say that when it's measured against external structures, that's the dimension wherein a tafsir remains in line with the methodological emphases of the classical tradition. For example, philology, nahwa, abrogation. But again, there's a debate over what abrogation is, asbab an-nuzul, the occasions of revelation, and things along these lines. But then, and that's also instrumental, but then also ideological. And these ideological structures would then be, we could even say, to use contemporary academic language, it might be useful to say, and again, to borrow from Dr. Frank, is to say discursive structures. and that is again in how it's answering contemporary issues. Now, what we do in our course on contemporary Quran and Hadith studies is to demonstrate how the study of the Quran and the Hadith is developing within the Western Academy. How that differs from those dimensions of these traditions, the Tafsir and Hadith traditions, which are central to Muslim teachings and to Muslim identity, one could say. And then how we can look within the classical tradition, such as how theology has developed, how Islamic law works with the Quran, and how philosophy works with the Quran, for ways that we can employ the Quran and employ the classical interpretations of the Quran for reflection upon the issues that Muslims face in the contemporary world. That's an overview of both a little bit of what we say about tafsir and how we try to employ it. When we had our Quranic studies program, we had courses such as Al-Masail al-Kubra fi al-Quran al-Karim, that is major themes in the study of the Quran, or for Dirasat al-Quraniyah, and other things along these lines. And as we move, inshallah, towards a PhD program, that is something which we will, inshallah, introduce into the PhD program as well. Thank you all very much for coming. And again, if there are any questions, we are happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Joseph, for that enlightening discussion of tafsir. A short overview for you there. We have approximately 15 minutes for questions, and what I'd like to do is basically go through the questions as they were asked. Some of these are related to technical issues regarding applications, and I'll mostly deal with those. And then we have one or two content questions, which I'll ask the professors to comment on. Unfortunately, one of our attendees, Kamala, she couldn't get the sound to work. I mean, it's one of those things with the technologies that we're using, unfortunately. Sometimes we can't get them quite right on the day. But the good thing is that this session is being recorded, and it will be uploaded to the HBKU YouTube channel when it's ready. So if you did miss any aspect of it, or you wanted to review some aspect of it again, we'll be able to see it there on the YouTube channel. In addition, many of our speakers, in fact, most of them, will be doing the second session, which is a week today at the same time. And then that session, we won't be talking about course content, but we'll be talking about research trajectories of our faculty. So they'll be talking about some of the research that they've been undertaking. So if you found this appealing and attractive, then you can join us again in a week's time, where we'll discuss the research of our faculty members. Some of the questions are, we've got two questions, one from Naufal and another one, I think, later on from Valdrine, who are both asking about language requirements. Okay, so in the case of Naufal, he's done some English language studies in Malaysia, and it's a standard test in Malaysia, and he's asking, can he be exempted from IELTS or TOEFL? And similarly, Valdrine is asking about a Cambridge School Diploma for Intermediate English. The problem with both of those is that they're not international standards that we recognize, and that's why we insist on IELTS and TOEFL, because they're international standards which are recognized. And if we go to, if I can share my screen with you, I can do that. I'm not able to share right now. Is there a reason? Oh, there we go. Thank you very much. So let me share this one and go to the admission requirements. Can you all see that page?
Not yet. If perhaps you share the slide, Dr. Gavin. Thank you.
Oh, I'm trying to share actually Google Chrome. Oh yeah, sorry about that. Okay, you can see it now, I think, yeah?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So here on the language requirements, IELTS 6.5 or TOEFL 7.9. And the important thing is there are some exceptions to that, and they're written below. So a student can be exempted from language proficiency requirement if they meet one of the conditions listed. So what are those conditions? The applicant completed their studies at a university in a country where English is the native language. In other words, when English is your native tongue, you speak it on a daily basis. The applicant provides an official letter confirming that they obtained their degree from a university where the medium of instruction is English. In other words, that all of your studies were in English. If you get your university to write us a letter saying that the courses of study you took were in English, that's sufficient for us. And the applicant's first language is English. In other words, you're a native speaker of English. Something else to remind ourselves of are the dates here. So this is an important page. It's admission requirements. The important dates for students applying internationally is the 1st of February. In other words, if you're an international student, you're not a resident or a Qatari student, you need to get your application in by the 1st of February. So that's very soon. And you can apply online through this website. So you don't actually send anything to us as faculty, but you send it to the admissions department where it says here, apply now. Okay? And that will guide you through the process of all the documents you need to upload. There was a question again from, I think, students who were graduating this semester and had studied other degrees and were interested in studying Islamic studies at the master's level. If we look at required field of study, we can see that the previous degree, your first degree, your bachelor's degree should be in Islamic studies, Middle Eastern studies, religious studies, or relatable areas within the arts, humanities, and social sciences with appropriate experience. In other words, you could have done a degree in sociology or something like that, but you need to tell us that you have some experience of Islamic studies. Otherwise, starting a master's degree from scratch might be difficult for you. But if you are not sure, then what I would say is apply, and then we'll judge your application when we receive it. One of the other things that I should say for a student who has studied from a different field than Islamic studies or any of those mentioned there is that you should make your application appealing to the review committee by expressing why you want to study this degree in your personal statement. In fact, the personal statement is one of the key things that we look at. And this is how we judge and how we differentiate between the very top candidates and some of the lesser qualified candidates, because many students have very good grades. That's what we're looking for, but we want to know why you want to do this degree. And this is one of the reasons we did the test session, so that you could learn more about it and perhaps see from the lectures that we've had this evening how this might appeal to you. So that's related to language requirements and students from another degree. Valdrine also asks, she hasn't graduated yet, but can she still apply? Yes, you can. However, even if we really liked you and wanted you to be here, Valdrine, we would need to see the finalized documents before we could issue an acceptance letter to you. In other words, as soon as you received official transcripts and some from your university, you would need to send those to us as soon as possible. From Fahad in Uganda, he says, I've applied 3 times. Can I apply again? Yes, of course you can, Fahad. But, no problem. We would happily receive your application for the 4th time. Now, what advice can I give you? I just actually touched on that idea. Maybe one of the things that was missing was in the personal statement, that maybe your grades are fine and that's okay and you have the background that we're looking for, but we need to be convinced that you really want to come here and study this particular master's degree. And you need to convince us of this in your personal statement. Okay, now we have a couple of content questions. One is from Iman. She says, Jazakallah khairan kathiran to all the professors for these incredibly interesting testers. I'd like to ask that between each class and across the MA as a whole, how much liberty do students have to investigate questions of their own interest, either through the class content or assignments? So I leave that to the professors in each of their classes to how much liberty they provide their students. Who'd like to go first?
I'll go
Yeah,
first.
go ahead, Joseph.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. All right. I would say that in the courses, so let's say, for example, in the introduction to Hadith and Quranic studies, contemporary Hadith and Quranic studies. In that course, a student can do something that just looks at, a simple field of study, or one could do something more creative. And let's say if one was, for example, working on and wanted to move with their final project towards a study of the impact of a particular school of thought in contemporary India, then they could study one of the key figures on that paper. Students have also done thematic studies within that course. In addition, when you look at the course on post-colonial theory and Islamic thought, that's something that offers a lot of different ways in which it can be applied. On the one hand, one could write within the vein of post-colonial studies, and on the other hand, one could write how a particular approach within the classical Islamic tradition or a particular thinker offers keys for how we can approach a contemporary issue of some kind. And in that way, in a sense, be building what we would refer to as the actual trans-modern epistemic widening that post-colonial studies advocates, but never really gets to because it remains a Western field of discourse.
I can follow up with that, and I can say that in terms of Quran and Hadith studies, we co-teach this course, and Dr. Lombard takes the Quran aspects, and I take the Hadith. And actually, all the students in the last semester chose to write about the Quran. So yes, they do have a great deal of freedom, and indeed, they often explored questions which were related to their interests, as long as they were in the broad remit of the course. Dr. Yusuf, you wanted to follow up.
Dr. Gavin, in fact, in my course, one of the two courses I teach, the other course is Applied Research Methodologies in Islamic Studies. The course on Muslim encounters with other societies, I give students the opportunity to explore whatever geographical or temporal context that they feel are appropriate. If, for instance, I have a student from the Philippines and she's interested and we're talking about interfaith relations in the United States or Europe, she wants to write her thesis, not her thesis, but her final paper for the seminar. She wants to write it on the context of the Philippines. Certainly, I give students the latitude to do that. Similarly, when students develop case studies, they select case studies that are of interest to them, and I help them to develop those case studies and to write about them and to contextualize them within the context of the course. So there is very much a great deal of latitude for students to explore themes that eventually could turn into their topic for the MA thesis, or could be related to their interests, for instance, with the MA thesis. Thank you.
Drs. Alex and Frank, would you like to add anything, or do you think it's sufficient?
Yeah, I would just reiterate what my colleagues have said. I think we In my courses, I have a number of questions that students have to address, but they can address them in different ways in relation to their own research interests, right? And they have to actually um, display the capacity to relate the questions that I ask to their own readings, knowledge, and interests. So that's something that we value actually. So like my colleagues have said, that there's wide scope for you to explore your own research interests within the ambit of the courses that you take.
So one of the questions said he was interested in the field of interpretation. I assume it's Quranic interpretation. And as we just heard from Dr. Lombard, that indeed tafsir is one of the major themes within the Quran and Hadith course that we teach. And indeed, we had at least one presentation, if not a paper on that. So yeah, it would be an opportunity for you to engage deeper with the field of tafsir. Okay. I have a question about PhD in Islamic Studies. Actually, we don't have a PhD in Islamic Studies yet. We're working on it. Someone with familiarity in the general area, could they be accepted? I think that's unlikely because the PhD is usually very highly specialized. But when we have a PhD, we'll have a more concrete answer for you. Salam, Dr. Picken, wa alaikum salam. If we say we catch a mistake in a portion of our application materials after submission, is there any recourse to correct that? What my understanding is that the admissions department give you a login and a kind of a login and specific identity for your application, and you're able to re-access that at any time, even after you've submitted it. That's what my understanding is. But if you have any issues, you think, with your application, and you don't think you've been able to catch it, so to speak, please feel free to contact me and I can look into it for you. Technical question regarding the applications. Though I have graduated in December 21, my university does not issue official electronic transcripts, but can email an official hard copy transcript or on the online portal. Should I submit an unofficial electronic transcript for the time being and have the official transcript sent directly to CIS? You don't send it to us, send it to admissions. That's number one. Yes, you can apply for the time being, but as I said, we couldn't issue any acceptance letters without seeing the full documentation. Jazakallah khair. It was nice to be part of the discussion session. Eagerly want to learn about some tips for successful undertaking the PhD program of Islamic Finance and Economy from their respective professors. Actually, we will be having another information session around the 16th of February, and the professors from that program will be speaking there for those of you interested in that. Okay, so Fahad has a follow-up. He says, okay, sorry, I missed it again. You go, okay. Can you apply for both contemporary Islamic thought and fiqh in society? Yes, you can. However, you must be able to demonstrate the requisite background for both specializations. In other words, if you're going to study in English, you have to be able to provide the requisite documentation for that. And if you were going to teach in study in Arabic, you'd need to be able to do that as well. Someone asked about the thesis for Fiqh and Society. The thesis for Fiqh and Society is in Arabic, as all of the classes are. So the Fiqh and Society specialization is entirely in Arabic. The language of instruction is Arabic, the language of writing and reading is Arabic, and so is that of the thesis. Does the issuance of an acceptance letter guarantee a scholarship? No, it does not. The acceptance letter purely means that we found you an acceptable student to our program, and there are 6 international scholarships at present, and they're highly competitive. In other words, we select the very best students. That's why the personal statements become very important, because it's through those that we determine if you're a candidate that we would like to interview or not. So that's something I would focus on if I were you in your application. Okay, maybe the last question, one last content question from Iman. Another question purely out of my own curiosity, so feel free not to answer. I will feel free not to answer because it's not my field. Is Islam decolonial? What I mean by this is, does the Deen offer instructions or guidance for decolonial processes and decoloniality?
That's a very good question. I would say that in some ways we could actually say that that in terms of part of it is what you mean by decolonial. There's also the idea now that people say of decolonialization. And what they mean by decolonialization rather than decolonization is that decolonialization is the process of removing the epistemic hierarchy that the West has imposed upon the world, wherein epistemologies that derive from and were developed within the West are viewed as being superior to all others and then imposed upon other societies and used to even tell other societies how they must define themselves. Well, that's an idea that as Muslims we inherently reject. And so, yes, we do. Now, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, Napoleon, during his time when he occupied Egypt, there was an alim a day was killed. This is a recognition that the intelligentsia posed the greatest threat to the project of colonization. And in this way, one could say that what we can do is we should derive post-colonial theory helps us to deconstruct the epistemic hierarchy that the West has imposed and that unfortunately many people have internalized. But it doesn't offer us the actual kind of trans-modern world in which we recognize that there are many epistemic locations that are not necessarily arranged within a hierarchy. And indeed, as some of the crises that we now face as humanity as a whole, it's also shown that it doesn't have solutions. I'm sorry to say this, but Bill Gates and Elon Musk are not going to save us from the environmental crisis. And so when it comes to issues like that, what is real sustainability? How would we define sustainability Islamically? That's a completely different question than how people are trying to define it in terms of the scientistic tradition of the Euro-American Academy. So in that respect, we go into the classical tradition and it provides us with the bases for epistemologies that approach these issues from different perspectives and help us to come up with solutions that are in line with and in harmony with the teachings of the Quran and the Hadith.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. I'm sure we could go on with this discussion, and I'm sure we might. As I said, we have another session next week where our professors will present the research, so we can continue again then. I'll take 2 last questions, and then we'll close the session for this week at least. We have a question about the recommendation letters. Recommendation letters usually should be from your former professors. In other words, professors who knew you well during your undergraduate studies and perhaps worked closely with you on a personal project or some kind of research exercise or something like that. So that would be perfect if we could get something from your professors stating what kind of student you are and why they recommend you to our MA. We've got a question from Fatima, which says that if the language of instruction is Arabic, is an exception from the IELTS exam or not. With regard to the fiqh in society concentration, or sorry, specialization, although everything is in Arabic, we still require the student to have a basic level of IELTS. It's not as high as the contemporary Islamic thought 6.5 or 79, but we do require a basic level of English. What I've done is that I've sent 2 links in response to that question at the end there. One is about the program, so you can read more about the program on that web page, which is www.hbku.edu@QA, ENCIS MA Islamic Studies. So that's about the program and its structure and the courses. And on the admissions to our program, we can find at www.hbku.edu.QA/EN/CIS admission requirements. So whether it was related to the admission requirements, the language requirements, whatever, to the contemporary Islamic thought specialization, where we need a higher level of IELTS, or it's related to the Islamic Law and Society specialization, where we need a high level of Arabic and some kind of basic level of English, you can find the details there. None of these materials should be sent directly to the professors. All of these materials, all of your documents need to be uploaded to the admissions website and HBKU. If on the page I showed you earlier, it says apply now. That's where you upload everything. So thank you for your attention. We hope you really enjoyed the session. We've enjoyed delivering it to you. We've hoped that this has sparked your interest in the Master of Arts in Contemporary Islamic Studies. As I said, this session will be recorded and eventually uploaded to the HBKU YouTube channel. In addition to that, there's another session next week where we'll be seeing the research of our professors and more opportunities to ask questions that you perhaps didn't have time for today. So thank you once again. We look forward to seeing you next week, and good evening and salam alaikum from Doha.